Welcome to Give Theory a Chance. This conversation with Dr. Sarah Shannon took place during a virtual visit with my Sociological Life Lessons interdisciplinary colloquium at SUNY Brockport. All right, today we are joined by Dr. Sarah Shannon. Sarah is a sociology professor at the University of Georgia. Sarah has been recognized multiple times for excellence in the classroom, and if you go on her website, the list of teaching awards is actually too long. I don't want to take time going through them all right now, but I can say when I was in grad school, Sarah was a teaching assistant for my statistics course, and actually, already I could see that she was an amazing instructor. Although since then I've forgotten everything from, I don't use any stats anymore. But at the time, you were an amazing instructor. Her research has been published in the top sociology and criminology journals, and perhaps most importantly for our class, Sarah has been committed to public sociology in many different forms. This includes facilitating University of Georgia's first ever Inside Out Prison Exchange Program course, in which she worked with the local Clark County Jail. Sarah's also been involved with Context Magazine, the Society pages, and now First Publics, which is a name that you should recognize because some of our conversations will be posted on that site. So that's one of the motivations when I started thinking about this type of class. So let's start by thanking Sarah for joining us today. All right, Sarah, can you get us going by introducing one of the topics that you've researched or written about?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for having me, Kyle. This is really fun. So my area of research more broadly is trying to understand social inequality through the lens of the criminal legal system, and particularly the ways that punishment contributes to and or exacerbates social inequality. So I've studied a number of different forms of punishment, including incarceration, probation, ways that people continue to be punished through what we call collateral consequences, like restrictions on voting and getting jobs. But more recently, I've taken a foray into studying what we call monetary sanctions, or these are sometimes called legal financial obligations. And they essentially encompass all the ways that people can be charged money as part of being involved with the criminal legal system. So this includes things that can be charged pre-trial, in the course of being convicted and sentenced and punished, in other ways, including fees and fines that go along with being incarcerated or under community supervision. And it turns out there's a legion of these kinds of ways that people can be punished like this. And so I had the good fortune of joining a research team in 2015, and we had a 5-year grant-funded project and then a subsequent project that was also funded for 3 years. And I've studied this phenomenon from all kinds of different angles. And I won't ask you all to raise your hands, but it's very possible that some of you have had to pay monetary sanctions if you've ever had a speeding ticket, or there's lots of different ways that these things impact people's lives.
So feel free to jump in at any point. I'm curious, what's the range of monetary, what's the amounts that we're talking about? So we're familiar with the smaller amounts, which would be something like a speeding ticket, but what kind of upper ends do we see with this?
Well, this varies, like everything when it comes to punishment in the United States, really varies by state and even by locality. I was in charge of studying the system and how it works in the state of Georgia, where I teach and live. And here, for example, yes, there's all kinds of smaller things, maybe lower cost things, like a few $100 for a speeding ticket, which for many people who can't afford to pay them is actually, might as well be millions of dollars, right? But there is at least one offense, I think it's drug trafficking, that comes with a mandatory $100,000 fine. It may be even higher than that. I mean, so usually there's multiple different types of costs that people have to pay. So there's the fine, which is the main thing that we're used to thinking about, right? A speeding ticket fine. And that's sort of considered the punishment. That's the part that's supposed to hit you in the wallet, right? Make you feel the pain of the wrong that you've done and pay the penalty. But since the 1990s, states have really proliferated all kinds of different add-ons. Sometimes they're called fees, sometimes they're called surcharges or additional penalties. And this was really began as a way to try to make up for ways that states and localities were losing revenues as the federal government kind of generally pulls back. Then state and localities, it kind of devolves downwards. And so these fees started to pop up as this kind of idea of having offender-funded justice. The idea behind these fees and surcharges is that those that are using the system, aka those that have run afoul of the law, are the ones that should have to pay for it. And so some states have hundreds of these, some states have a handful. But the amounts can really vary anywhere from adding on a $5 law library fee to surcharges that are a percentage of whatever the base fine is. So let's say your base fine is $500, that's what you're being charged as the penalty. Well, this surcharge might be an additional 10% on top of that. And by the time you add on potentially up to 10, 15, 20 or more of these additional penalties, we found that that can often double and even triple or more the actual amount that someone ends up being required to pay.
So, two related questions. How did you find the particular topic? And then perhaps more importantly, especially for everyone in the room who's thinking about what to do for an honors thesis, how did you decide it was worth your time and worth researching?
Yeah, so I got invited onto the initial project. It was kind of lucky in that the organization that was funding the project really wanted to add a state in the Deep South. And as often happens in social science or really any kind of science, who you know and who you're connected to can really matter. And so my PhD advisor, Chris Eugen, who's also a great champion and mentor in public sociology, he was on the project and he said, I know just the person who's in Georgia in the Deep South. And so I met with the principal investigator or the faculty member who was in charge of the overall project, Alexis Harris in Washington, and we decided it was a good fit. And I mean, I was really excited because it was a new area for me, but it still corresponded in many ways to my broader research agenda. And also I was pre-tenure, so I was really in need of projects and opportunities to publish, and I knew that this would mean working with a great team. There were 8 total faculty members on the project, several of whom are real luminaries in my area, in my field. And so those were the things that made it worth the time. Plus, it came with the opportunity to mentor graduate and undergraduate students. So because it was such a big, kind of relatively long project over 5 years, I incorporated not only graduate students who I paid as research assistants, but also undergraduates through our university's undergraduate research opportunity program. And then those students, some of them have written their thesis based on some portion of the data or something related to the project. So it was really also an opportunity to mentor and to bring other students into the fold and get exposed. Those students then got connected with these other great, sociologists and criminologists from around the country.
Okay, that transitions really well into my next question, and then after that I want to see if people have any follow-ups at all. What was your methodological approach? And I'm really interested because you were working as part of a team rather than just going out by yourself gathering data.
Yeah, so the first project was incredibly comprehensive. It was multi-method, so we did whatever we could in each one of the 8 states that were represented. So Georgia was one of them, but there were 7 others as well. We went after whatever quantitative data we could find, and it turns out, huge gaps in terms of data available. So Minnesota and Washington were both on the project, and those states do a much better job of keeping and making data available on these topics, whereas Georgia, I literally talked to someone at the state level who works with courts data, and they told me I should consider a career change. That going after this data was going to be impossible because it doesn't exist. So we just had a real range when it came to that part of it. But I was able to get some quantitative data from our Department of Community Supervision, which oversees probation. And really, a lot of the monetary sanctions in Georgia come along with a probation sentence. And so that was the purchase I was able to get on the quantitative side. But then qualitatively, we did interviews. We did hundreds of interviews across the 8 states. So we interviewed court decision makers, including judges, lawyers, probation officers, and clerks. And in total on the project, we had around 450 of those individuals that we interviewed. And then we interviewed people who were subject to monetary sanctions, people who owed that money and who were maybe on probation or who had been in the past. And again, I think it was somewhere, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but somewhere around 500 or so of those individuals as well. So, and we were trying to interview people who were involved both in like felony level courts, so the more serious kinds of offenses, but also those in the misdemeanor courts, which is where, at least in Georgia, you'll find people going to court for things related to traffic, which are misdemeanors. Not every state considers those to be criminal, but in Georgia, technically they are. But it includes also everything sort of in between.
So with the missing data, is that because that people are just not collecting, like the local law agencies are just not collecting that information, or they're not willing to share that information? Because those seem like two very different things.
Yeah. And one other piece of data collection that I almost forgot was we did hundreds of hours of court observations. So we literally went and sat in these courts and we picked jurisdictions in the state and we watched people be sentenced to these things. We watched these court actors in action as they were doing this work. But in terms of the data, it's kind of a combination of both. The main thing in Georgia is that there's no centralized repository. So in states like Minnesota and Washington that had better access, it's because their state systems require that courts report these things to a central reporting mechanism. In Georgia, every little court is its own thing, and many of them contract with third-party data management systems. That means that they're paying for this external entity to collect and manage their data, and sometimes those local jurisdictions don't even have easy access to their own data. So it's a mess. Yeah. And then the quality, anytime you're dealing with government administrative data, you should always be questioning the quality of those data, but just the availability is lacking in a lot of places.
I'm just peeking around to see if anyone has a follow-up. Oh, there we go.
Sorry you can't see me, I'm a little off screen, but the whole the add-ons to the initial charge, how legal is that? Because like thinking about that seems, is that legal in every state?
Indeed, yeah, it is legal. I mean, it's not that there aren't legal cases that have been brought, and so there are some, and we tried to look at some of those cases. In particular, I know in the state of Georgia, because so much of this revolves around probation and charging probation fees, there were multiple cases, especially in the 20-teens, that really focused on private probation companies that were charging kind of exorbitant amounts of fees. Again, are another add-on. So imagine like you're being supervised by this agency, the court has imposed this on you and is then requiring that you pay for your own supervision. Some states, not Georgia, but some states also charge like a daily fee for being incarcerated. So yes, these things are illegal, but yes, there's been some like legal cases trying to argue whether or not some of these things exceed certain thresholds. For example, there's a kind of a famous case in Georgia called Bearden v. Georgia, that was a ruling related to that people can't be incarcerated simply because they cannot pay fines and fees. So that's something that's kind of generally known as debtor's prison. And so the Supreme Court has ruled that that is not constitutional. But what we saw and observed and heard from people is that often they were afraid that their probation officer would lock them up if they didn't have the money to pay, and so they didn't show up for their probation appointments, and that failure to appear or failure to show up for your appointment is a cause for, or can be used as a cause for a probation revocation, and that can result in incarceration. So it was kind of this backdoor way that people were being incarcerated because they couldn't pay, but it was because they were afraid and weren't showing up for their appointments.
And then to clarify, so if someone is pulled over and it doesn't matter what the crime is, but they have to pay a certain amount, where does that money go? Does it remain strictly at the local level? Does it get to the state level? How far does this money, where does it trickle to?
That's $1 million question. So there are multiple sort of beneficiaries of these monies. Typically, the base fine stays in the county or in the local jurisdiction. So it could be also some cities have ordinances that carry fines, and those would stay with the city, right? But these add-ons, fees, surcharges, it really depends. Often there are some that will go into a state general fund, and again, states really vary what's required. There are multiple different like retirement funds for criminal justice actors, like sheriffs, prosecutors, clerks. So typically, I know in Georgia and other states, some portion of the fine is required to submit to those, and then the percentages could go to whatever the beneficiary fund is. So in Georgia, there's a brain and spinal injury fund that is used for a great purpose. It helps people who experience these kinds of traumatic injuries, but they're not necessarily directly related to, like, say this can be imposed for reckless driving, for example. Well, I may not have recklessly driven my car into someone and caused a brain injury, but that surcharge that's added on to my fine goes to that fund, and then those funds are distributed through that fund's rules and regulations for who can apply and receive those funds. And that's a 10% surcharge. That again may have nothing to do with my actual offense, but is mandatory in those kinds of things. So the question, varies by state, and there's a lot of concern about oversight and accountability for, are these funds actually going where they're designated, and then where are they being used? And that's really a black box, a question that is pretty difficult, if not impossible, to answer.
And even if they were going where they're technically supposed to, it sets up a pretty clear incentive structure, because if, I don't know, Daniel, I'm making you a cop for the example. If Daniel's worried about his retirement fund, he benefits from finding more people to arrest or charge with whatever crime carries this, builds the pot, right?
Exactly, and this is what was discovered in Ferguson, Missouri. Michael Brown was killed in 2014, and then in 2015, the Department of Justice did this huge investigation of Ferguson's, not only the police department, but also the municipal government. And it was very clear, it was literally, people wrote this down in emails and stuff, like, literally, we need you to go out and arrest some more people because we've got this need to kind of plug this budget hole or whatever in. So it was literally black and white, but as others have said, there are thousands of Fergusons all over the United States. I mean, I could name several small towns in Georgia that it's pretty well known, and people will even say, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I own a brick in the new courthouse for what I paid, for my speeding ticket through that town. And one of the jurisdictions that we went to court and interviewed in here in Georgia, there's this very, very low population county south of what we call the gnat line, where the weather changes, gets a lot warmer, and
like a gnat, like a bug.
Like the bugs, yeah.
Okay.
It's literally called the gnat line. It's like south of Interstate 20, and this was literally the only jurisdiction down there that had its own traffic unit at the county level, and that's literally what they do. Is they're right on Interstate 75. And they just camp out there, and they catch people speeding between Atlanta and Miami or what have you. And their traffic court stays busy, and they bring in millions of dollars a year to their teeny tiny little county. So
Wow.
yeah, for real.
All right, so this is a question that's probably for me and the 1.5 other sociologists in here. But is there a particular social theorist or theory that you have found either inspiring or useful as you've been conducting this research?
Yeah, well, most recently, I've been really fascinated by the court actors and what they're up to and how they understand the work that they're doing and why they're doing it. And that's allowed me to really tap into organizational sociology, which isn't like an area of the discipline that I really trained in or knew that much about. But organizations have been a really key focus of sociology for a long time. I mean, going way back to the beginning, Durkheim was concerned about social cohesion, and so organizations were important in that respect. Karl Marx is thinking about, class struggle and how organizations play into that. And so my interest in organizations and their impact on inequality, is also another new, kind of not new, but kind of emerging vein that's gotten more attention in recent years. So it's not really one particular theorist, but really kind of tapping into that broader literature on how organizations work. And in particular, this paper that maybe you shared with your students, it started actually more with an empirical finding, which was none of the decision makers in the courts seemed to know what they should be doing around certain really key processes, including discovering whether or not individuals were indigent, whether or not they could afford to pay their fines and fees. By statute, in many of these states, they're supposed to do some kind of a process to determine whether or not someone has the ability to pay these things. But we never saw it practiced in the courtroom. When we interviewed court actors, they were like, well, I don't know, I think that's somebody else's job, or that's not my job, or, gosh, that's really concerning. We should be doing something about it, but we don't know what. And so I tapped into this literature on organizational ignorance. And there's a whole body of work on how using ignorance or claiming ignorance can be really useful, not only to individual actors, but also greasing the wheels to keep organizations running. It really felt like when we were watching this happen in court that it was like this train with no engineer. Like no one was steering the thing. It's just chugging along. It's just grinding up people's lives, with these financial penalties, but nobody seemed to know where it was going or why. And so that's been something recently that I've really gotten kind of excited about and enjoyed delving into.
We got another question.
Was there a certain group of people that were more impacted by these fines, did you find?
Yeah, I mean, so it turns out that there's a whole bunch of us out there that, if I get a speeding ticket, it's a blip for me, it's a bummer. Like I didn't have that in this month's budget, but I can cover it. So for a lot of people, they're able to pay their fines and fees, and it's kind of more of a bummer. Maybe they don't go out for as much coffee, maybe have a few less lattes that month, but the people that are really impacted are those who are poor. And we know in the United States that tends to skew towards people that are minoritized in other ways, including by race and ethnicity and all of those different lines of division and inequality. So that's really the concern, and that was the concern in Ferguson as well. It was really clear that it was Black folks in particular in and around the St. Louis area who were being disproportionately impacted by these fines and fees. And then one of the main problems is that when individuals can't pay, states have different mechanisms for either adding further penalties, including interest or late charges, right? Or referring your debt to a third-party collection agency that then will charge more, on top of that. So it really becomes this way that people who are minoritized or poor and in various ways become tethered to the system for much longer than they should be, or much longer than even their punishment would be if they just, did their time, in jail. So, yeah, is definitely disproportionate impacts on kind of the typical groups that we think of as being disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system more generally.
You've been doing some of this along the way, but are there any other findings, or is there another finding that you'd like to share from this research?
Yeah, man, there's so much. We've published a whole like 2 volume. It's open access on the Russell Sage Foundation's journal. But one of the other things that was really fascinating and sort of sad, but I was on this paper with some of my graduate students on what we call the symbiotic harms of monetary sanctions. We didn't coin that term, someone else did, but what we saw is very clearly in our interviews with people who owed this kind of debt is that this is the one punishment that other people can take for you. Meaning, when you can't pay your fines and fees, your mom can, your daughter could. So we found all of these instances in our interviews where people would talk about how their mom cashed out some part of their retirement in order to pay their fines and fees, or their daughter, oftentimes it was women, it was moms and daughters that were doing this to try to help their sons and or daughters out of this debt. And so it was really this unique case where nobody else can do your time in prison for you. Nobody else can be on probation for you, but somebody else can pay your fines and fees, and it turns out the state doesn't care. They don't care where the money's coming from. They'll take anybody's money. And so it has these broader ripple effects on families, not only financially, which is huge, but also we found that it was leading to conflict, to other kinds of effects on family dynamics, on people's ability to engage with their families, to be parents. People were frequently having to make really painful trade-offs. Do I pay on my fines and fees this month, or do I buy diapers to help my baby mama out? It just really has all these different ramifications, that punishment that ripples beyond the actual individual who is purportedly being punished.
Yeah, and that's a recipe for such intense stress in a relationship, and it's easy to blame the other person who did the thing that's now they owe the money for, and there's a shortage of money. So yeah, I could see the disasters that it would cause.
Exactly, yeah, and those are the kinds of things we found people articulating in our interviews.
Okay, so this is the final question, unless students have some additional add-ons. But this is the part where we often stop as academics, right? We do the research, we talk about how it relates to the theory, we talk about our findings. But then my question is, for students in the class or anyone listening to this, what lessons can be taken from your research? What type of life advice can you give from conducting this academic project?
Just don't get in trouble with the law. Keep your nose clean.
Yeah.
No, I mean
that's a good start. It's dangerous. Even if you don't end up in jail, they'll take your money. So that's a good start.
They will take your money. Yeah, I think this is one of those topics where people don't necessarily know a lot about it, or they sort of just take it for granted or don't think of it as being really all that big of a deal. That was another thing that often the court actors were like, oh, that's just something, yeah, it's on the form, I just fill it out and I don't even think about it. And even lawyers were like, well, I'm most concerned, like defense attorneys were like, I want to keep my clients out of jail, so I'm not even thinking about the fines and fees. So I think it's there were lessons for me in terms of being able to really delve into a topic that hadn't seen as much daylight, but is highly consequential, and then finding different ways to communicate about that. In terms of I've sat on panels at the law school where there's judges and lawyers and all kinds of people coming, and so being able to be a part of those broader conversations with stakeholders, and really being able to back it up with the evidence that we've gathered from the research project is important. I served as an expert witness on a case that was a similar kind of situation in another location, and so that having that sort of empirical evidence to be able to then be of use in a case that was attempting to address some of the harms that people are facing was also really important. Oh, and I had the opportunity too to go and testify in Washington D.C. in front of the Commission on Civil Rights that were looking into this issue. I think it was in 2017. They did a report. Again, this was kind of coming on the heels of Ferguson, but it's just kind of opened up, I think, all these other opportunities beyond the publishing in academic journals, but really being able to speak to people who are hopefully decision makers and can act on this and potentially bring about change. And there has been change in several of these states. I don't know if always directly as a result of our research, but our research is often cited and used in generating reforms, legal reforms, as well as court cases. So that's also been really fulfilling.
I have one more question, but I'm going to see, does anyone else have a follow-up question before I ask mine?
Oh, I see a hand.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, you had talked about how states and principalities will raise the fees for more money for the offender-funded justice system. Where does the pros and cons of that? What are other options besides offender-funded justice?
The main other option is raising taxes, which this is America. We don't really like that idea, or it depends on where you live, right? So, and that's really part of the problem is that, in the ways that from the federal government on down, these costs have been passed down without revenues being provided or generated in other means, including through tax. So there's really kind of this like underlying kind of like value, like do we value criminal justice and public safety as a public good? Like we all want to be safe, right? I want to drive out there and not have somebody, T-bone me at the intersection. So am I willing to pay more in my taxes so that the police can be out there making sure that people aren't, running red lights? Or do I think, well, this is just really all about bad people, and we can put all the burden on them, regardless of whether or not they're poor, to pay for the services, right, that they're receiving. So that's been the justification. There's sort of these two kind of competing ideas. And I think if we leaned more into well, this is a public good. It's important to all of us that we have functioning courts, that we have, some modicum of public safety, then that's something that's worth, taking a little bit more of a ding on your paycheck, but again, this is where we live, this is the time we're in, so that's been a lot of what's driven the proliferation of those fees and add-ons.
Do you have another follow-up? I've got one final question. So as you were in your I guess not your previous answer, but the answer before that now, you were discussing some of the spaces where you've been able to share this type of knowledge and share the findings of your research and hopefully have a positive impact as a result. How do you get into those spaces? So from a pragmatic perspective, there are a lot of researchers who do the work and they come up with important findings, but then it ends there. And so what did you do to get yourself out there and end up testifying in these various places or being the expert witness or things like that?
Yeah, well, some of it actually is by kind of getting the work out there in different ways. It turns out that I got invited to speak at our law school symposium, and then I wrote a piece based on that presentation that got published in the Georgia Law Review. And it turns out that, lawyers and others sort of read those things or pay attention to that. And so then I think like the expert witness stuff, I think, came because someone came across that article and it happened to relate to what this case was focused on. And I think sometimes it's just being willing to answer those calls, to pick up the phone, to answer those emails. Not every academic is up for that. And certainly in recent years, I've become a little bit more leery, honestly, of like talking to the media or doing things like op-eds. But I think, some of it too comes from on that particular team. Our lead researcher, Alexis Harris, was already really pretty well known in that space. And then she'd already done a lot in Washington State to bring awareness and to help promote some reforms there. So then that sort of becomes like contagious within the team, and that's how the opportunity to testify in DC came through. That she wasn't able to go, and she invited me to go instead. And so sometimes it's the opportunities present themselves, but you also have to be willing to do it, and it's really hard work. I mean, it's really stressful. I did a deposition for that expert witness stuff, and that was really stressful. And it was something I hadn't done before, and so you kind of have to be willing to take the opportunities too when they come.
All right, awesome. Let's call it there. Let's thank Dr. Shannon again for joining us and sharing her research and her ideas and life lessons. So we really appreciate it.